You need to see every second of this. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent drew the big picture perspective of how the current tariff plan is going to work, and it even left CNN's Kaitlan Collins struggling with a comeback to these arguments. Here's the highlights from this exchange you can't miss because there's so much that I think it ties into.
As these are going to an effect, I imagine some of these countries are going to call and try to negotiate this. Is that an option for these countries over the next few days, or what is the White House's mindset on that?
Well, I think the mindset is let's just see where we are, and then we'll see how President Trump feels about all this.
Okay, so it's essentially up to President Trump if he's in the mood to negotiate with some of these countries.
Well, I mean, it's not the mood. It's the how are we seeing things? I think the real thing is going to be, and that he's going to gauge the tariff level by, it won't be necessarily the calls from the leaders, it's going to be the calls from industry saying, okay, how can we get these off? And he's going to say, you can get it off. Bring your factory to the U.S.
And here's what has already happened this past week. More than 50 countries have reached out to the United States, finally willing to sit at the negotiating table to avoid a spiraling trade war. And that's precisely the bargaining chip they were always meant to be. As some Trump officials have remarked, if these countries hate tariffs so much, then why do they have them? By the way, this channel is where you find the uncensored truth, so please make sure to subscribe to Millionaire Mentor to always be the first to see it. Now remember, all of the countries reaching out or sending trade delegations are sending them because they have more to lose. And that means they were the beneficiary in decades of globalist trade policy that they were using to rapidly industrialize at the expense of the American worker and on the backs of the American marketplace.
A lot of these are our closest allies, South Korea, Japan. When you look at those countries and the tariffs that they're being charged, if they're calling, what would you say to those nations who may have concerns about how to lower these numbers?
Well, I would say they've been doing it to us for a long time. Right? And if they don't like tariffs, then why do they have them?
And should we view these as permanent?
That I think we're going to wait and see how this plays out.
And if countries retaliate, which some have said that they would, some have said they wanted to wait and see, what is the White House's response going to be to those countries?
Well, Kaitlan, one of the messages that I'd like to get out tonight is everybody sit back, take a deep breath, don't immediately retaliate. Let's see where this goes, because if you retaliate, that's how we get escalation. And
then it becomes a full-fledged trade war, in your view?
Not a trade war, depends on the country, but remember that the history of trade is we are the deficit country. The deficit country has an advantage. They are the surplus countries. The surplus countries traditionally always lose any kind of a trade escalation. So I did, as a student of economic history or a professor of economic history, I advise against it.
So you're essentially saying that they should not retaliate?
I would say that doing anything rash would be unwise.
Let me blow your mind with one fact that should put all of this into perspective. Take a look at how America's record high trade deficit has almost doubled in the span of the last few years to a staggering $1.2 trillion with a T dollars. This is money that the US economy is bleeding every year to the outside world, and most of it would not even exist if other countries, especially China, did not already have massive tariffs on US-made products. So just flip your perspective for a second and you realize what the US is doing right now is not even new for hyper-trade protectionist regimes like China, and to an extent, even a lot of the European Union.
You've said before that tariffs should be used strategically. What is the strategy in that? What is the ultimate end game for that?
No, I'd said that that's one use of the tariffs. Go back all the way to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton used them to raise revenue. He used them to protect industry. And President Trump has added the third leg of the stool, which is strategic. So, if we are thinking about a 10% global tariff, and let's assume that we import about $3 trillion a year, so that's $300 billion, and that's a substantial revenue raiser that could then be used for working Americans on no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, and for those buying autos, they can reduce their bills because interest on American-made cars will be tax deductible. So this is really a working class, the tariff and tax plan.
I haven't seen anywhere in the mainstream media mention what Scott Bessent said here, which is that tariffs are just one side of the coin for a more holistic rebalancing of America's trade relations with the outside world and the tax burden on the domestic worker. And I think if you read the fine print of the Trump executive order, there is a sign that these tariffs could be renegotiated if the trade imbalance is addressed and more manufacturing supply chains are brought back inland. Part of it reads, quote, "These tariffs will remain in effect until such a time as President Trump determines that the threat posed by the trade deficit and underlying non-reciprocal treatment is satisfied, resolved, or mitigated." And while that happens, there will inevitably be a degree of uncertainty that the market does not like, which will inevitably speed up that rebalancing process.
We're seeing international markets start to respond to the president's announcements. Obviously, the markets in the United States are already closed. What do you expect the stock market to look like when it opens tomorrow in reaction to this?
I don't know. I don't know where it's going to trade open tomorrow. I don't know where it's going to close tomorrow. And I think what's going to be important are the underlying economic fundamentals, because at the end of the day, Warren Buffett says in the short run, the market's a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine.
And that's true because we've seen the S&P 500 drop nearly 11% after Trump's announcement of these tariffs, and that was always expected when you pull a reverse gear on decades of trade policy. When the market is uncertain, it withholds its money. When that realignment is complete and money starts flowing into domestic industries rather than bleeding abroad, that's when investors know where to pour their money with confidence.
But on what you mentioned on what the president promised on the campaign trail, whether it comes to no taxes on tips or Social Security, do you envision this in a large way helping pay for that? Because sometimes that's a criticism from critics of this White House, saying that he's just using these tariffs to pay for the extension of those tax cuts.
Well, for the extension of the tax cuts or the new no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime, and auto deductibility. And look, what's wrong with that? That if we take the 10% ring around the globe tariff, that if there's a currency appreciation, if the producers eat a portion of it, and then there's a slight price adjustment, on the other side, you have all four of those things happening for working Americans. At the end of the day, we could imagine that their real after-tax purchasing power has substantially increased.
And that's the other side of the coin that everyone seems to be leaving out, which is that it's part of an active plan to give the American workers more of their purchasing power back, as well as opportunities to make that money when they're no longer being undercut by foreign labor. But let me know in the comments what you see happening in the short term and the long term with this radical rethink in trade policy, because tens of millions of Americans actively voted for an administration that made these policy changes clear from the start.